The afternoon was restless. Clouds rolled over the city, heavy and gray, pressing down on the streets below, as if the sky itself had grown weary. The air carried a charge, not of storm but of tension, the kind that vibrates in the air before voices rise and tempers ignite. At the edge of the government square, a crowd had gathered, their chants echoing against the facades of stone buildings. Signs waved, fists punctuated cries for justice, and the lines of uniformed police formed a human wall between the protesters and the sealed doors of authority. The scene was familiar to the city protests had risen before, often fading into the background of politics. But today felt different. Today, the voices were sharper, the faces more desperate. They were not merely shouting slogans, they were pleading, demanding to be heard. In their cries lived grief and frustration, a rawness that made even seasoned officers glance at one another uneasily. And then, through the throng, he appeared. The tomb guard did not belong here. His place was among marble and silence, not in the chaos of chanting crowds. Yet his stride cut through the mass with quiet force, a river of composure parting the current of unrest. Dressed not in ceremonial attire but in a plain shirt and trousers, he might have blended into anonymity, were it not for the unmistakable stillness in his bearing. His shoulders straight, his gaze forward, he carried himself with the discipline of centuries, the kind that marked him even when the uniform was gone. The protesters noticed him first with confusion. Some lowered their signs, unsure if he was an officer or a government envoy. The police stiffened at his approach, hands tightening on their batons, suspicion flickering in their eyes. He walked with the same deliberate pace he used when pacing before the tomb, each step measured, steady, grounding. And when he reached the line between protesters and police, he stopped. For a moment the square seemed to inhale. He did not turn to the officers. He did not raise his voice to the crowd. He simply stood motionless, calm, as though he were back at his post. To some, it looked absurd, a single man planting himself in the middle of two forces ready to clash. To others, it looked dangerous, reckless even. But to the tomb guard, it was neither. It was necessary. The police exchanged glances. One of the lieutenants stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Step back, sir. This is not your place." The guard's eyes shifted to him briefly, steady but quiet, then returned to the horizon. He did not move. The protesters murmured among themselves. Some saw him as a symbol of solidarity. Others as a mystery. Why would a man known for guarding silence insert himself into chaos? What did it mean? Slowly, the chants faltered, replaced by a low hum of questions, uncertainty spreading through the crowd. Minutes passed. The tension grew heavier, not lighter. The police line shifted restlessly, unsure whether to push forward or to wait. The protesters hesitated, signs lowering as they studied the solitary figure. It was as if his stillness had disrupted the rhythm of confrontation, pulling both sides into unfamiliar territory. The guard's mind, however, was not on appearances. He remembered the call that had reached him earlier that week, whispered from one veteran to another, a message carried through quiet networks of those who still believed in unseen bonds. Among the protesters was a mother whose son had served, a boy barely 20 when his life ended far from home. She had come not out of politics but out of grief, her voice breaking as she demanded answers. Her pain had been drowned in chants, her presence overlooked by police and officials alike. And so the guard had come not to take sides, not to inflame but to stand. Because sometimes silence, planted firmly, speaks louder than the noise around it. The crowd did not know this. They only saw a man in plain clothes whose discipline marked him as different. Whispers passed, "Isn't he one of the guards?" "The ones at the tomb?" Others scoffed, disbelieving, but the posture was unmistakable. Few men could embody such immovable calm. Slowly, recognition spread, and with it, a shift in mood. The police grew more unsettled. They had been prepared to manage anger, to counter chants, to contain a surge of bodies. They had not prepared for the quiet defiance of someone who commanded respect without raising a fist. One officer muttered, "Why is he here?" The lieutenant, unsettled, had no answer. The mother's voice rose then, breaking through the murmur. She stepped forward from the crowd, her hair graying, her hands clutching a photograph worn at the edges. Her voice trembled but carried, amplified by desperation. "My son gave his life for this country. All I want is for someone to remember, for someone to tell me it mattered. That's why I'm here." The guard's eyes flicked toward her, the faintest acknowledgement, then returned forward. But that single glance was enough. She understood. She clutched the photo closer, tears spilling down her cheeks, and those near her fell silent. The protesters around her lowered their signs, their chants fading. They turned to look not at the officers but at her, at the picture of a young man smiling in uniform. And in that silence, the guard's presence became clear. He was not there to defy the police, nor to embolden the crowd. He was there to ensure that one mother's grief was not lost in the noise. The lieutenant shifted again, his voice less certain now. "Sir, you need to leave. Please." But the words rang hollow. For the first time, even the officers sensed that the moment had shifted beyond orders. The sky above darkened, clouds gathering heavier as though mirroring the weight of the square. Yet the air did not break into violence. It held, taut and fragile, balanced on the stillness of one man who refused to move. The square held its breath. The chants had died, the shouts had dissolved, and all that remained was the strange magnetic stillness of a man who stood where no one expected him to be. The tomb guard's posture was unwavering, his eyes forward, his arms at his side, yet the gravity of his presence seemed to outweigh the combined force of signs and shields, batons and slogans. For a fleeting moment, both protesters and police found themselves disarmed, not by confrontation, but by silence. The mother's voice broke again, trembling but clear. She lifted the photograph higher, her arms shaking under its weight. "He was 20 years old," she cried, her voice carrying across the plaza. "They told me his sacrifice mattered. They promised me he would not be forgotten. But when I asked for answers, when I asked for truth, they turned me away." Her words sliced through the air, sharper than any chant. Some protesters bowed their heads, others wiped tears from their eyes. Even the officers, hardened by years of crowd control, shifted uneasily, their eyes flickering to the image of the boy in uniform. The guard did not speak, but his presence spoke for him. He took one step forward, just one, and the sound of his boot against stone echoed like a drum beat. The crowd hushed further, the police line stiffened. He turned, at last, to face the mother. His expression was solemn, but in his eyes shone recognition, understanding deeper than words. Slowly, deliberately, he moved toward her. The protesters parted instinctively, as though sensing the sanctity of what was unfolding. When he reached her, he stopped. For a long moment he simply looked at the photograph she held, his gaze lingering on the young man's smile, the crisp uniform, the life frozen in time. Then, with reverence, he lifted his hand in a slow, perfect salute. Gasps rippled through the square. Some clasped their mouths, others reached for the hands beside them. The mother's knees buckled, and tears streamed freely down her face. She lowered the photograph, clutching it to her chest, and whispered hoarsely, "Thank you." The police, watching from their line, felt something crack inside. They had been braced for violence, for rocks or fists or shouted insults. They had not been prepared for this, for the quiet solidarity of a man who embodied duty itself, who had chosen to stand not against them, but with a grieving mother whose pain was undeniable. The lieutenant lowered his baton. His voice, when it came, was softer than before. "Who is he?" he asked one of his men. The younger officer shook his head. "He's one of the guard. The ones at the tomb." Recognition flickered across the lieutenant's face. He swallowed hard. For a moment the weight of protocol warred with the weight of humanity. And humanity won. He stepped back, gesturing for his line to ease. Batons lowered, shields shifted. The wall between authority and protest cracked, not from force, but from compassion. The mother reached out, her trembling hand brushing the guard's sleeve. "They don't listen to me," she said, her voice breaking. "But maybe they'll listen to you." The guard lowered his salute, his gaze never wavering. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, steady, resonant. "I stand with you because your son stood for all of us. His memory deserves more than silence. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of centuries. The crowd erupted not in cheers, not in chants, but in applause. Raw, uncoordinated, human applause. Hands clapped through tears, voices cracked with gratitude. Protesters dropped their signs, some kneeling in respect, others embracing strangers beside them. Even the police found their eyes wet. The lieutenant turned his face away briefly, composing himself, before nodding once, as if to acknowledge what could no longer be denied. This was no act of rebellion, but of remembrance. The square transformed. What had begun as confrontation became vigil. Candles were lit, passed from hand to hand, until flames dotted the plaza, like stars scattered across stone. The mother's photograph was placed at the fountain's edge, surrounded by flowers pulled from pockets and bags. People knelt, prayed, whispered names of their own loved ones lost. The air no longer vibrated with anger, but with reverence. The guard remained at the mother's side, his presence anchoring the moment. He did not speak again, did not move beyond what was necessary. Yet his stillness carried them all, reminded them that sometimes respect is not shouted but shown, not demanded but given freely. Hours passed, and still the crowd lingered. The police did not disperse them. Instead, they stood quietly, some even joining in lighting candles. A few stepped forward, laying their own flowers, their rigid faces softened by the recognition that they, too, were part of the human fabric woven by sacrifice. When dawn broke, the first light touching the plaza, the crowd began to thin. People left in silence, their faces marked not by triumph or defeat, but by something deeper. The mother remained, still clutching the photograph, her tears finally slowing. She looked up at the guard and whispered, "You gave me back his dignity." The guard inclined his head, then turned and walked away, his stride steady as ever. He did not seek recognition, did not crave headlines. His duty was fulfilled, not to politics, not to protest, not to police, but to memory, to love, to the unseen sacrifices that demanded to be honored. In the weeks that followed, the story spread. At first whispered through the city, then carried by news reports, then shared across the country. The guard who stood with the protesters, they called him. The takeaway was clear and unforgettable. Sometimes loyalty demands silence. Sometimes it demands obedience. But there are moments when loyalty demands that we stand where no one expects us, so that dignity is preserved and love is remembered. But those who were there knew it was never about protest. It was about a mother's grief, a boy's memory, and a promise kept. And so the tomb guard returned to his watch, standing again in marble silence. Yet the image of that night lingered. The mother's tears, the crowd's hush, the police lowering their shields. He carried it with him in every step, every salute, every moment of silence, knowing that true honor is not confined to ceremony, it lives wherever compassion dares to stand.